Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Let me go straight to what I have to say. So, in a sentence from one of the readings I suggested you look at, one of the most difficult passages within those readings, and in fact, possibly one of the most difficult passages in the whole of Derrida, Derrida writes this. I've tweaked the translation a little bit. The general structure of the unmotivated trace has communicate within the same possibility and without one's being able to separate them except by abstraction, the structure of the relation to the other, the movement of temporalization, and language qua writing. So I'm going to propose that sentence as an epigraph and indeed as a kind of matrix for approaching Derrida in this lecture. I'll assume on the basis of what he says here that his most general thought is to do with what he here calls the trace, and that the three areas or strands that he says are tied up together in that thought can be taken as three possible ways in to understanding. But rather than attempt to approach Derrida via the movement of temporalization, which would mean looking closely at some of his most difficult philosophical writing on Husserl and Heidegger, I'll begin with the language as writing, language qua writing route, and try in the later part of the lecture, if we have time, to say something about the structure of the relation to the other. I'm assuming no prior knowledge at all of Derrida's work, and as always when dealing with undeniably difficult thinking, I'm going to try and keep things as simple as I think they can reasonably be kept, with, of course, apologies to those of you for whom it will be elementary. Now, prioritizing this way into Derrida, the language qua writing way in, has no absolute justification over the other two possibilities that he mentions here. But it does have some definite advantages, especially for those of us who are not formally trained in philosophy. And I'm going to try to exploit those advantages as much as I can. It does also have some downsides, especially in that it can tend to leave the mistaken impression, and often has left that impression, that Derrida is all about language and has nothing to say about the real world. That mistaken view probably focuses in on a notorious claim in another passage that I suggested you might read, a famous claim usually translated, "There is nothing outside the text." In French, il n'y a pas de hors texte. Literally, there is no outside text. So I'll run for now the risk of leaving that false impression that Derrida is all about language, but I'll try to come back and show why it is, in fact, a mistake. However, promising the language qua writing way into Derrida is, then, we should bear in mind that, as he says, it's something of an abstraction. He says they can only be separated out by abstraction. It's something of an abstraction with respect to that more general and, I think we'll see, quite difficult thought of the trace. Taking the language route into Derrida does put him in some pretty good company among 20th century philosophers, be they continental or analytic, who all tend to think language is a much more central, important, and difficult issue in philosophy than was thought by earlier philosophers. Some of you may be familiar with the idea that there was a linguistic turn in philosophy, dated sometimes the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And I will be dwelling on that idea for a while, even though in the end I hope we'll see it doesn't quite capture what's specific and important about Derrida's thinking. Now, for many of us, especially those like me with a more literary than philosophical background, this way into Derrida, this language way in, was historically how we got into deconstruction in the first place, and it's probably the one we're most comfortable trying to explicate. Whence the readings I suggested to you, especially the chapter Linguistics and Grammatology, from his famous 1967 book, De la Grammatologie, from which this epigraph is taken. And as you'll see, if you struggled through that chapter, it's centrally concerned with a reading of the linguistic theory of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, often thought to be the father of modern linguistics and the main inspiration behind the movement known as structuralism. Now, I do want to spend just a few minutes sketching out some of Saussure's thinking, often thought to be familiar, but I'm surprised how often it's misunderstood and misrepresented these days, as if there were a kind of fog of false familiarity that prevented people actually reading Saussure anymore. So I will be saying a little bit about him for a few minutes now. Part of what's interesting about Saussure is that he set out to establish a scientific study of language. In his view, linguistics had failed to achieve status as a science because it had never satisfactorily found or defined its proper object. He set out to do that, and then through what's essentially a single brilliant insight, which arguably he didn't fully understand himself, as is often the way with brilliant insights, right? They're often blinding. He wound up suggesting, or at least implying, that taking the measure of the complexity of language should lead to a radical shake-up of what it is to have an object at all, even in the apparently successful sciences he was seeking to emulate. And then, by shaking up what it is to have an object, the suggestion is that would lead to a fairly radical shake-up of what it is to be a science at all. So Saussure starts out thinking he knows what science is and he wants to make linguistics conform to that idea. And he winds up seeing, or at least glimpsing, that something about the way language works will disrupt that idea and perhaps all other ideas of science. There are other movements in Saussure where he's a little bit overwhelmed by his insight. When he thinks he has identified the object of a scientific linguistics in what he famously calls la langue, the language system that makes it possible for us to say what we say. And then he tries to describe that object in terms of a contract or a convention or an institution, but he finds repeatedly that it can't be a contract, convention, or institution like any other, just because any contract, convention, or institution presupposes a language in which it's made. It's made possible by language, which can't then be placed on the same level as those other contracts, conventions, or institutions it makes possible. Now, when I ask my students what's so great about Saussure, they usually mutter something about the linguistic sign being arbitrary. That's what everybody knows, right? And Saussure does indeed say that the linguistic sign is arbitrary. But this is often understood to mean no more than that there's no intrinsic reason why we use the words we do for the objects that those words name. And the existence of other languages is often advanced as a proof of that fact. So we call that leafy thing tree, but we might have called it arbre or baum or arbol, or indeed anything else at all. The problem with that view of what's special about Saussure, linguistic sign is arbitrary, is that everybody since Plato and Aristotle has thought that the sign is arbitrary in that sense. So that can't possibly be what's special about Saussure. And the 17th century British philosopher John Locke even uses the word arbitrary to describe the linguistic sign. So what really makes Saussure special is that his notion of arbitrariness goes much further than that older view. In that older view, language is thought of on the basis of a model of naming. Saussure, some of you will know this, calls it the Nomenclature View of language. And it conjures up an entirely mythical image of a time in the past when people sat around and agreed what we should call things. There's no intrinsic reason to call a tree, but we do so because sometime in the past our forefathers agreed, by convention, to call it that. Now, this is a hopeless view of language. Even if it did work with simple objects and their names, which it doesn't, it rapidly runs into all sorts of difficulties with more complex or abstract objects, and of course with all the very many parts of language that aren't nouns. It assumes quite wrongly that when we get into trouble with language, For example, when we don't know what a word means, we can always solve our problem, at least in principle, by going out and pointing at the thing the word names. Now, I have a slide to summarize this nomenclaturist view of language. So there's the tree out in the world. The bracketed tree on the left is for the Platonists who think there's a shiny idea of a tree behind the actual tree you see in the world. And then there's the guy with the little picture of the tree in his head. I guess he should be looking at the tree, right? No, he looked at the tree and then he turned away. And then he turned away and said the word tree. I use the slashes there just to indicate that this is the signifier, as we usually say, tree, and what's more, the spoken signifier, tree. And then sometimes, if he really had to, he might use the written form, which I indicate with the angle brackets. So that's the sort of Lockean, but if you really want with a Platonic left-hand end on it. And that's what Saussure is going to disrupt with what I called his brilliant insight. That brilliant insight has two parts. The first consists in saying that a word, or more properly a linguistic sign, is not tied to its object in this kind of way, tied to its object, what's sometimes called its referent, in this pointing or labeling kind of way, but that it famously, you all know this backwards I'm sure, unites two parts or sides or faces, which he famously calls the signifier, roughly speaking, the sound of the word. We'll explain why that's rough if you want to talk about it in the Q&A. It's not exactly the sound at all, but roughly speaking, the sound of the word is the signifier, and the signified, which he often a bit carelessly calls the concept. And only on that basis, once we've got the sign stuck, signifier and signified together, might we then go out and find a tree to point at or to identify through our sign tree, or we might, apart from saying it, also sometimes write it down. So on this view, the sign comes away from its old-fashioned referential mooring, and as it were, it floats about in the milieu of language itself, which sounds nice enough. But if that's the case, what on earth secures the sign's identity? I say identity, I just mean two things. What means we can distinguish it from other signs that it isn't? And then the other thing is, how do we recognize it again when it comes back? If it's not tethered to some solid object somewhere, the way it was in the old-fashioned nomenclaturist view. And this is the second part of Saussure's brilliant insight. It gets that identity purely from its place in the system of language, its position as different with respect to all the other signs in the language, what he often calls its value. The sign is much more arbitrary than the conventionalists ever suspected, and that extra arbitrariness, says Saussure very forcefully, must entail the thought that the sign be differentially identified. Saussure himself says arbitrary and differential are correlative qualities. And this principle of difference Saussure finds at work at every level of linguistic description, so that signifiers are held apart from each other and secure their identity through their differences from each other, and so do signifieds, or concepts. I'm not sure if you can read what I've got there. This is a rather pathetic attempt to give a sense of what Saussure is talking about. So on the concept level, it's the bottom little circle there. Tree enters into relationships with shrub and bush and sapling, and I think I put diagram because of arborescent tree diagrams. That's part of what determines the meaning of tree, the signified tree. Then the upper one on the level of the signifier, tree is tree because it's not free, true, trough, try, scree, and other terms with which it's in some kind of proximity, let's say. It's a very unsatisfactory diagram, but I think it gives a little sense. So Saussure says that only this differential identification, the sign gets its identity in this differential way, only that then allows us, in some cases, to go out into the world and find objects like trees that we might point at and name. So unlike as in Locke, for whom the meaning of the word tree comes from its being attached by convention to the little picture I have in my mind of a nice solid object out there in the world, which object and little picture have absolutely no need for language in order to be what they are. Language comes in late in the day in the Lockean story. On the Saussurean model, the sign gets its identity from its difference from other signs, and only that allows us any kind of clear concept of what a tree is and any ability to identify trees in the forest of objects or entities. So you can see we can give to that notion of linguistic turn a fairly straightforward sense. The classical Lockean model starts at the left-hand end and moves across to the right as language eventually kicks in. After the turn, we're starting in the language, so more down the left-hand end, and then moving back towards, more down the right-hand end, and then moving back towards possibility of objects. And the written form of the signifier is still just sitting there as a question, which we'll come on to in a minute. Not quite all. What I called Saussure's brilliant insight is given a last radicalization from which, again, he pulls back. He kind of panics and pulls back from this further ramification. It isn't even that the signs in the language are somehow first there. I think I just did something with my foot that switched off an important thing down here. It'll teach me to rock backwards and forwards while I'm speaking. It's like a very subtle trap for the lecturer that this room is set up. Okay. So it's not that the signs of language coming first, as we're now suggesting they do, are somehow there in their signiness and then get identified by their differences. As Saussure memorably puts it, we have to think of a system of differences without positive terms. I'm sure you know this slogan-like description. Hard to think, hard to get your head around that the differences, or rather the differentiation, come before what they differentiate. If you like, language forms a kind of network in which what we thought were the elements are like the holes in the net. And this difficult thought will now allow me, I hope, to move to Derrida and start sidling up to his notorious notion of différence. You might think we were doing just fine with Saussure, so what does Derrida have to add? First this. If Saussure is right about all this difference business, then the whole notion of the sign from which he begins starts to crumble. And it starts to crumble because the whole signified part of the sign, what Saussure sometimes calls the concept, starts seeming quite unnecessary to describe what's happening once we've operated the turn and started the language story not with the tree, but with the sign tree held in place by that differential organization of the language system. On the old model, the pre-Saussurean model, if I come across the word tree and I don't know what it means, I need to get an idea of tree into my head, and most obviously that means being taken out in the real world and shown a tree. On the Saussurean account, if I encounter the word tree and I don't know what it means, that amounts to having a signifier but not a signified to match up with it. Where are we going to find the signified? Well, what do you do when you come across a word you don't know the meaning of, or in Saussurean talk, a signifier for which you do not have the signified? You look it up in the dictionary. But what do you find in the dictionary? A lot more signifiers. Maybe you don't know all the words used in the definition of the word you first looked up, and you chase them down elsewhere in the dictionary. All you'll ever get is more signifiers. I often send my students off in search of a signified. I've promised real rewards to students if they can bring me a signified. And after all these years, none has ever managed. I've seen a lot of signifiers, but I've never seen a signified. Now, people often lose their nerve at this point in the story that we're telling about language and assume that this kind of theory makes it impossible for words to have meaning anymore once we decide that the signified is, in a sense, superfluous to this account. The Oxford professor response, if you like. I did my graduate work at Oxford, so I got a lot of this. Well, obviously absurd. Monsieur Derrida claims there's no meaning, but clearly expects us to understand his meaning when he says there is no meaning. Ridiculous. But of course, in most cases, at a certain point, the way those signifiers are seen to relate to each other in their differential negative kind of way we've described does seem good enough to count as having grasped what the word means. So what we thought we needed was a signified to complete the sign. What we got was a bunch of interrelated signifiers that seem to do the trick just fine, though we always might add in new signifiers into the group or constellation that comes into play as counting as the meaning. So I say let's just ditch the whole business of a signified and try to complete the linguistic turn, or turn it a little further by saying that it all starts not with the supposedly whole sign, but with the signifier. And what we were always tempted to call meaning or signified just emerges a bit like a ghost or a spectre from the interrelation of signifiers among themselves. As Derrida puts it at the very end of the linguistics and grammatology chapter, I bet a lot of you didn't make it to the very end of that chapter. At the very end of that chapter, he says, the signified is always already in the position of a signifier. That's what he means. So we've pushed Saussure beyond what he says explicitly. Saussure never gave up on the idea of the sign. We've pushed him to the point where we want to claim with Derrida that the difference insight, the insight about differences without positive terms, is more powerful than and destructive of, or let's say it, deconstructive of, the notion of the sign that Saussure developed it to account for. And on this radicalized view, beyond Saussure now, signifiers don't actually signify signifieds at all, but always only other signifiers as we chase around in the dictionary. Or we could say that signifiers refer on only to other signifiers in a definite and an indefinite and generalized structure of referral. But then, wait, what? You know that guy in the pub you're trying to explain deconstruction to? What's he say at this point? He says, hang on, mate. What could signifier possibly mean if it doesn't mean something that signifies a signified? And indeed, if we stick to signifier talk, which has done us fairly well so far, we'll probably get into some confusions. Thinks Derrida. One of his suspicions about Lacan, who's happy to hang on to the notion of signifier, Derrida thinks probably is going to induce all sorts of confusions down the road. So let's see if we can find a better word to use, having accepted the story we've told so far. And Derrida's suggestion, hoping as he is to do justice to his own brilliant insight, is that that better word is the word trace. So what just happened again? We deconstructed the concept of the sign, or rather following and putting a little pressure on Saussure's thinking. Let's say we found the concept of the sign deconstructed. I don't really want to say that we deconstructed it, because it kind of just happened. And I don't really want to say that it deconstructed itself, because that gives it all sorts of kind of magical powers that I don't really believe in. So I want to use this semi-passive, middle-voiced type formulation. We found the concept of the sign deconstructed. Why are we happy to see that happen? Because it turns out that that concept, this is something Derrida talks about in the interview that I suggested you might look at. It turns out that that very concept of the sign, the very notion that language is made up of signs, that Saussure thought he could take up and redefine as part of his effort to establish a scientific linguistics, it brings with it a whole lot of baggage from a long tradition, baggage that Derrida relates to all manner of other baggage from what he often just calls the metaphysics of presence. And this itself is in fact in line with another of Saussure's insights, this idea that there's baggage carrying when you talk a certain kind of way. Because remember, Saussure's account is partly directed against the conventionalist view that somehow in the past people sat around and agreed what to call stuff. But it can't possibly have started that way. Language can't possibly have started that way because we'd already need to have enough language up and running to do the agreeing. If I hold something up and say, what are we going to call this then? We could call it anything, obviously, in the old view. What should we call it? And somebody says, I don't know, let's call it a bottle. Is everybody okay with bottle? Bottle's okay? All right, this is what we'll call a bottle. Obviously, that's a lot of language involved in even coming to that agreement. So that view of how language got up and running can't possibly work. In fact, we have to think that language isn't really an agreed convention at all, but something that's always there before us, always already, as we say, and that we always receive it or inherit it like the law, says Saussure. Whether we like it or not, we inherit all our language from a tradition we don't entirely control or choose. Much later in the 1990s, in a book on Marx, Derrida says, to be is to inherit. And the ways in which the inherited system of differences is organized is not entirely in our control. And that's also why Saussure's text is sometimes unequal to its own best insights. Saussure saw that difference was the principle of language. Derrida, reading Saussure in a fairly strong sense of what reading is, sees that that principle of difference ends up ruining, deconstructing, the concept of the sign that Saussure had himself inherited from the long tradition before him. One of the very many elements of that traditional concept that in Derrida's view holds Saussure back from being able to realize the full implications of his own insight is that language is primarily and originally to do with speech. This can seem like a totally common sense view of language, as indeed can the Lockean point and name it model. In the first main subsection of the Linguistics and Grammatology chapter, Derrida has no difficulty at all showing that when Saussure explicitly addresses the question of writing in his work, he really rather feebly repeats some very ancient positions and prejudices, most of which are already at work in Plato. Now, I'm actually less interested in rehearsing the detail of those prejudices, though we can easily reconstruct them, if you like, in the Q&A. I'm less interested in that than in what we can learn about Derrida and deconstruction from how Derrida handles those prejudices in his chapter. A more kind of methodological point about what Derrida is doing in reading Saussure in this strong sense of reading that I just mentioned. When it comes to writing, says Derrida, there can be found in Saussure what he calls on the one hand, what he, Derrida, on the one hand calls a propos déclaré, a declared purpose, as it's translated, and on the other hand, an autre geste, another gesture. So this type of distinction, something like this distinction, is fundamental, I think, to deconstruction and the way that it does its reading, and it shows up in one guise or another across Derrida's work. So the thought, some of this is formulated in that slightly later section called Question of Method, that I suggested you also might look at. The thought is as follows, right? Saussure explicitly advances a number of claims, in this case about writing and the bad things that happen if we give it too much prominence in our account of language. That's his declared purpose. Writing is bad and it's mistaken to give it too much prestige when you're studying language in a scientific way, the way I, Saussure, am trying to do. But he says a lot of other things elsewhere in his work that at least implicitly complicate or even contradict that declared purpose. That's the other gesture Derrida's referring to. And in the long reading of Rousseau that makes up part 2 of the Grammatology, which is something you can all look forward to reading if you haven't already, Derrida makes similar distinctions between what Rousseau declares on the one hand and what he describes on the other, between what he says and what he says without exactly saying, between what he wants to say or means to say in French, ce qu'il veut dire, and on the other hand, what he dit sans dire, what he says without saying. And I think it's a general tenet of deconstructive reading that texts, at least texts of a certain complexity, always in principle display something of that tension between what they mean to say, or we could say how they want us to read them. All texts give you some instructions about how they want to be read, and what they also say in spite of themselves. And this isn't just a dogmatic claim on Derrida's part that texts say one thing but also say another thing. It flows directly from that difference view of language that we were seeing in Saussure, right? All signifiers bring along with them an indefinite cloud or penumbra of other signifiers that hold them in place in the language, and those other signifiers never stop relating to further signifiers again, so that meaning is never just one thing. Text never just means one thing. This is another answer to the indignant Oxford professor who thinks that Derrida, if Derrida's right, there's no meaning. It's meaningless. Derrida certainly doesn't think that there's no meaning, but he certainly does think that there's never just one meaning. And that doesn't mean either that he thinks there are several meanings or even many meanings, which is often what he's taken to say, because that would imply that meanings were separable enough to stand up and be counted. We'd be back in signifieds again. Derrida's thinking doesn't promote an idea of ambiguity, as it's often thought to, nor even of polysemia, which in principle is a countable number of identifiable meanings that are then attributed to the ambiguous or polysemic signifier. Could mean this, could mean that, could mean the other thing. That's not what Derrida's talking about, but something he more often calls dissemination, in which each of those supposedly unitary and countable meanings themselves only ever emerge in the spectral penumbra of the trace. This excess, if you like, of the cloud or penumbra of signifiers over what actually appears in the text opens the space for an inventive practice of reading that's not simply deciphering an author's intentions, and that much later Derrida will claim is guided more by a concern for justice than a concern for truth. What Saussure declares in that propos déclaré, in the chapter that he explicitly devotes to writing in the course in general linguistics, is that speech is the natural place of language, and that writing merely represents speech. And it's true that in so-called alphabetic or phonetic writing systems, traditionally the writing systems that are valorized in the Western tradition, even within a general devalorization of writing with respect to speech, it seems in those systems, phonetic or alphabetic, it seems that the written signifier exists only to conjure up the corresponding spoken signifier, which alone is granted the privilege of having a signified. Unlike in so-called ideographic writing systems, where it's thought that there's a link from the ideogram to the meaning of the concept directly, the Western systems usually valorize thought that so-called, I say so-called because they're never entirely phonetic. Most systems really absolutely phonetic, but that phonetic or alphabetic writing is exhausted in representing the spoken signifier, which alone gets to have a signified. So writing is thought of as the graphic signifier of a spoken signifier that's supposed to come with a signified attached. But we've seen that if we take the Saussure of the system of differences seriously, this whole notion of the signified is in trouble. All signifiers, in a certain sense, are signifiers of other signifiers, and so on indefinitely as we chase around in the dictionary. And once we've decided that the signifier is defined by its difference, so differences without positive terms, if you like, an indefinite force field of dynamic differentiation is the kind of thought Derrida's getting at with différence, then it's hard to see how we could possibly justify the claim that Saussure explicitly makes that one substance of expression, the phonic substance of expression as linguists call it, or used to call it, could possibly have any kind of natural priority over any other, because difference by definition is not a substance or substantial at all. difference happens between substances as their difference, precisely, like the holes in the net. So neither speech nor indeed writing could possibly have any natural privilege of the sort that Saussure somnambulistically declares it to have in the wake of a tradition that he, for one, has not read carefully enough, at least on this point. So the deconstructive reading happens when one stratum of Saussure's text, that's the differences without positive terms stratum, is brought into, in which Saussure doesn't really talk about writing directly at all, is placed into relationship with another stratum of his text, the chapter on writing where he says speech is the natural place of language, brought in relation in a way Saussure himself never does. That's where the deconstruction happens, right? It's not done by Saussure, it's not exactly done to Saussure, it's all in Saussure in a certain sense, but it's putting into relationship that propos déclaré on the one hand and the autre geste on the other. Now you will have noticed I just said neither speech nor writing could possibly have any natural privilege, given the thought of difference. So you might reasonably ask why Derrida insists on calling what he's talking about language qua writing in the opening quote that I gave as the epigraph, and often elsewhere text. Okay, here's the thing. We already saw that we inherit the language we speak. It's always already there before us. On the view of language we've then developed in the wake of Saussure, there's no pre-existing realm of concepts or signifieds waiting for us to give them names in our specific language. That would be back in the old-fashioned nomenclaturist view that we've left far behind. We have to work with what we have at our disposal via this process of inheritance. In fact, sometimes that working with the inherited concepts for want of any other possibility leads Derrida to what can seem to be that rather flashy or desperate expedient of crossing some of the words out that he uses, so you can still read what's behind the crossing out, but you can see that they're crossed out, right? So that's like a gesture of saying, I don't have a brand new shiny concept to offer here, because after all I can do is work with the language and conceptuality I've inherited, but as a mark that I'm not satisfied with that or I'm suspicious of it, I'm going to cross it out in a way that makes some gesture, some kind of protest gesture almost graphically visible. Now, in this domain of thinking about language, that inheritance, the stuff we get to work with, that's handed down, as it were, includes terms like signs, signified, speech, and writing. How are we going to work with those terms, given that we kind of have to? Well, the term writing has been inherited from that tradition as meaning graphic signifier of phonic signifier. Remember, the phonic signifier is the only one that gets to have a signified in that tradition. The graphic signifier of phonic signifier, or more simply, signifier of signifier. What's writing? Signifier of signifier. What's speech? Signifier of signified. Right? Writing, signifier of signifier. That's the traditional definition. But now, the only sense we can make of language in general, given what we've done in pushing Saussure to his limits, is that all language is signifier of signifier. That just describes language. That's what this is about. Signifiers of signifiers of signifiers of signifiers as we chase around the dictionary and so on. And if we make that gesture, then all the predicates traditionally associated with writing since Plato that Saussure uncritically takes on, predicates like absence, death, mindless, mechanical repetition, dumbness, separation from an animating intention, and so on. We can talk more about this if you like in the Q&A. All those predicates come flooding back to describe language in general and invade the field previously cordoned off as the domain of so-called living speech, with its associated values of meaning, intention, consciousness, and so on. You have just a little sidebar at that point. It's not, as people sometimes think, that Derrida is claiming when he makes this gesture of saying the predicates traditionally associated with writing actually describe language in general much better than do the predicates traditionally associated with speech. So writing becomes the better candidate for the description of language in general. When he says that, he's not suggesting that everybody before him was stupid. He's not saying, look at stupid Plato, look at stupid Saussure, and indeed everybody else pretty much. The usual ways of talking about writing and contrasting it with speech in terms of absence versus presence, dead versus living, and so on, they're quite understandable, and they're so pervasive it takes a real effort of thought to see that speech is just as susceptible to absence, death, mindless or mechanical repetition, dumbness, separation from a present animating intention, and so on, as is writing. But that real effort is made much easier for Derrida than it was for Plato, or indeed Saussure, by the widespread availability to us of all manner of recording and broadcasting devices that mean we're constantly experiencing spoken language in the absence of the speaker, often enough after the speaker's death. It's one of the dividing points between speech and writing traditionally, is that speech, you've got the living presence of the conscious intending speaker. With writing, you kind of don't know. It hangs around. People go and die, and writing stays around in this troublesome kind of way. Of course, now people go and die, and speech hangs around in this potentially troublesome way. A lot of you, I'm sure, will have had this extremely spooky experience of hearing on your answering machine the voice of somebody who's since died. Like many people I know, I still have, I think, some messages from my parents from before their death. It's an extremely spooky experience that means that it's easier for Derrida and in his wake for us to see, in a way that for Plato or Saussure even would have been much harder, that speech is also affected by these possibilities of repetition in the absence of animating intention, death as opposed to life, and so on and so forth. It's spooky, but that spookiness is how language works, is Derrida's point. So, if all language functions as signifier of signifier, let's get their attention, says Derrida, by calling all language writing. Or sometimes, to try to avoid the risk that they'll think I actually mean writing in the narrow traditional sense, sometimes I'll call it archi-writing. Originary writing, if you like, writing before the usual distinction between speech and writing has even kicked in. But the risk that people will misunderstand is inevitable, right? This is also part of the deconstructive gesture. We're working with the materials we inherited from the tradition, what those materials bring with them. I can never completely remove or get rid of them. If I tried to use brand new concepts, nobody would understand what I was talking about. I have to work with the inheritance. The inheritance brings a lot of stuff, which, however hard I try, will tend to have people, as indeed many commentators did, complaining that Derrida has reinstated some medieval idea of the book of the world, or tried implausibly to suggest that writing really came before speech or something like that. None of those things is what he's actually trying to say. Dwelling on the inherited conceptuality, right? We inherited all these terms of the tradition. We did a bit of work with them. We intervene, as Derrida sometimes says, in the field we're discussing. In Derrida's case, that's sometimes a bit like sticking his thumb in their eye, right? Look, I'm calling it writing. Get that, right? There's a aggressivity in that gesture. But that's not all we're out to do here, right? And that's why we're actually not entirely satisfied with the term signifier once it's done the sterling work of showing it doesn't need a signified and justified the thought that maybe because all signifiers are signifiers of signifiers, we can decide that language is better described as writing than it is as speech. What's a signifier without a signified? It's always going to lead to trouble, as we saw from the man in the pub. So, Derrida tentatively, very cautiously, introduces this term trace in the wake of that movement of thought. Right? Why the trace? If words and concepts receive meaning only in sequences of differences, one can justify one's language and one's choice of terms only within a topic, some topic, kind of topology, and a historical strategy. Let me try to explain this trace thing a little bit better. And then, depending on the time, maybe a couple of things about the other two strands that he mentions in the text I used as the epigraph. Maybe we won't have time for that. Derrida, among other things, writes about, this is from those desperately obscure pages from which I plucked the epigraph. Right? He writes about a structure of referral where difference appears as such, but the movement of the trace is necessarily occulted. It produces itself as self-occultation. When the other announces itself as such, it presents itself in the dissimulation of itself. It's okay, right? Clear enough? All comfortable with that? As he indeed acknowledges in these same pages, this can sound a bit theological or mystical. And in fact, Derrida has often been accused of promoting a kind of negative theology. And it is definitely a bit spooky. And I often teach this stuff by suggesting that maybe we could dim the lights and close our eyes and let it go, just relax, just let it go. And just let it empty out. If we're lucky, maybe the trace will appear. Okay, I'm going to simplify this outrageously and use as an analogy for how this thought works. I'm going to use the letters of the alphabet as an analogy for the language system as a whole. Right? This is something Saussure does in a somewhat non-reflective way when he's trying to explain his differences without positive terms view of language. He says you can write the letters any which way as long as they remain differentiated from each other, but there's no substantial elements of them that make them the letters that they are. So I'm going to take that seriously and think about the letters of the alphabet, see if we can make one come up. So here's the letter B. I'll let you guess later why I choose the letter B rather than the letter A, for example. How do we know it's a B? How do we know it's a B? What is it? What grants the B its B-ness, if you like, rather than it just being an arrangement of lines on a white background? Well, story goes, it's a B because it takes its place in a structure of difference or of referral, whereby the B-ness of the B emerges from its differential relations with all the other elements in the system. So even here, when it's written alone in all its apparently shining presence, the B is a B rather than just some squiggle because of all the other letters that are not here present. But once that's the case, then the absence of all the other letters is in a sense present here too. The absence of an A, C, D and the rest is in a sense right here, constituting the B-ness of the B. Derrida is going to want to say that the present element, the B, bears the trace of the absence of all the other elements that allow it to shine forth as the B that it is. You can't see or otherwise intuit those traces, which is why this is somewhat bogus, what we're doing here. They're not, the traces themselves are not objects of experience. The trace of the absence of the other elements is not present in the sense of a possible intuitable content. Right? They're presenting themselves in the dissimulation of themselves. Right? The trace of the absence of all the others presents itself by not presenting itself. Right? It does not come forth. But the B wouldn't be a B without those traces. But that must mean that the absent elements that allow the B to be a B aren't simply or straightforwardly absent. They're not just absent. They're right here in their absence, as it were. They're busy, I'm tempted to say, busy as bees, making the B a B. And the word trace is trying to capture that strange ontological status that's neither simply present nor simply absent in the familiar sense of those words. Now you might say, oh, it's gone. I'm going to say, you might say, at least we've got our B. But where'd it go? But if the B relies, in order to be the B that it is, on the trace of the absence of all the other elements that it isn't, then it's hard to say that it's simply or straightforwardly present, just as it was hard to say that the others were simply or straightforwardly absent. The trace structure allows the B to present itself, but only by hollowing out that presence a bit, absenting it a little, spectralizing it in its turn. It turns out that nothing here is really either simply present or absent. There are what Derrida sometimes calls effects of presence, presence effects, if you like, emerging from the interplay of elements, none of which is ever straightforwardly or simply absent or present. And that interplay is what Derrida calls différence, with the well-known witticism in French that the difference in French between the word différence spelt with an E and the word différence spelt with an A, as Derrida spells it, can only be pointed out in speech by referring to the written forms. So it's a kind of revenge of the graphic form on the spoken. Okay, this all emerges for us at least by following what I started out by calling the language as writing, language qua writing way into Derrida. But you'll have noticed if you struggled with those dense pages from which I've been taking some of these formulas, which he describes the trace structure and its intrinsic occultation or dissimulation, that he seems to be making claims that go beyond the field of language, at least considered as a possible object of linguistics. And indeed he is. The trace structure, says Derrida with a nod and a wink towards Heidegger. He's also sticking his tongue out at Heidegger a little bit, I think, in the nod and the wink. The trace structure is at work across the whole field of beings, he says in these same pages. What Derrida calls the metaphysics of presence has consistently defined beings in terms of presence and absence. His ambitious claim via this notion of the trace is that the presence and identity of absolutely anything at all should now be rethought on the basis of the trace structure and différence. Just as with our brave and beautiful bee, entities or beings emerge into their apparent presence against the background of the trace structure, insofar as that structure has been described in terms of writing, archi-writing, text, then Derrida is going to say everything is textual, textural, as he sometimes says, interwoven, if you like. There's nothing outside that interweaving textual texturality, nothing outside the text. Reality itself is, in this no longer strictly linguistic sense, textual. There's no longer any clean and fast distinction between language and world, nor between human and non-human languages, for example. It's simply this differentiating web of traces allowing for differential effects of presence, which is why much later in that same book on Marx from the 1990s, in which Derrida says that to be is to inherit, and where he develops much more explicitly and in a sustained way the themes of ghosting, haunting, and spectrality that I've slightly unfairly used in presenting this material. In that book, he suggests that ontology in general has to be thought of or rethought as a hauntology. Haunting. Ontology is spectral, and so on. I was going to say a couple of things about the other two strands, but I'm going to skip and I'll be done in another minute or two. I just wanted to say that remember that in the trace structure, as we described it, around the now disappeared B there, it wasn't just that the apparently absent elements had to be thought to be somehow present, but that apparently present element had to be thought to be somewhat absented in its apparent presence. The B wasn't simply present. And according to the trace structure and the relation to the other in general, this bit I skipped, this is also true of what we often call the subject. In Derrida's view, just as objects and entities emerge always only spectrally from the play of textuality or différance, so with subjects too. It's not that I first sit in my subjectivity in a Cartesian kind of way, present to myself, and then occasionally the other comes knocking. What's the other knocking? More that anything like a subject only emerges in response to the other who's always there first before me. A bit like that language that I speak but I don't choose because I always have to inherit it in a somewhat passive way. You have to be careful with the notion of passivity, but somewhat passive way. Now, in later Derrida, this thought, which makes him extremely suspicious of the very concept of subject, develops into a generalized deconstruction of what he often calls ipseity, a more general thought of the self-sameness of the same in its supposed sameness. The presumed sovereignty of the oxymoronically named sovereign subject. And in this later work, the ways in which anything like a self or an ipse emerges is again and still, I think there's profound continuity across all of Derrida's work, thought against that différance that ceaselessly undermines those efforts towards self-sameness and self-possession in a way that Derrida tries to figure in his very late work, often with the figure of autoimmunity. The thought is that selves of all sorts, not just persons, and nation-states as well, ipses of all sorts, are constantly and more or less violently attempting to secure themselves and their precious identity, their immunity, if you like, against others of all sorts. You can see how this might go in an analysis of nationalism or white supremacism, for example. But in doing that, they're always compromised and in principle defeated. Even if that defeat generates further cycles of violence, it's certainly not a simple thing. Just because closing in on oneself in this identitarian way always leaves the surface exposed to the alterity outside, which becomes intolerable from the point of view of that self-proclaimed, supposedly sovereign ipseity. If you followed the argument about the trace and the constitution of effects of identity that are always compromised in their identity, then you'll understand the broad outlines of how these arguments go. All right, let me stop. Being told what to think is always reassuring, of course. In these later texts, which I've hardly mentioned, the later ethical and political texts, Derrida really doesn't tell you what to think. It's a kind of frustration with them sometimes. It's often been assumed, quite wrongly, I think, that because Derrida questions the unity of meaning, he must be in favor of the greatest possible lack of meaning or the greatest possible equivocation. I don't think so. If there were to be something like a categorical imperative of deconstruction, it would probably have to be something like, be hospitable to the event of the arrival of the other in general, and be inventive when you can. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. That was really helpful after having done the reading. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the unmotivated traits. I was having a hard time understanding that.
Yeah, it's where he makes those obscure distinctions, right, between the instituted trace, the unmotivated trace, and the originary trace. Right? I think the best way to think about those is that he's working his way towards the originary trace. So the trace in the most general sense, which is what I was also trying to get to, is something he gets at via thinking about the instituted trace. So when we're talking about the alphabet stuff, that's still within the realm of a kind of, I'm going to be careful with the notion of institution for reasons even Saussure knew, but it's still got that instituted, non-natural, something like a system of the language type, right? He's moving towards something that's not going to be instituted in that way. So he's on his way through that as a way of thinking towards, this trace structure seems really complicated. Maybe it's more complicated than you even think if you just stick with it at the level where Saussure's saying differences without positive terms. So I think instituted trace gets him started. Unmotivated trace is taking seriously what Saussure means by the arbitrariness, or the unmotivated. It's another way Saussure describes it, right? And all of that is moving him towards this more apparently cosmic set of arguments about the originary trace, at which point we're not really in language necessarily anymore, right? We're not in Kansas anymore. So I think I often found that a little puzzling myself, and I think he's a little, he's not as explicit about it as he might be, but what I've come to think is that that's the sequence, right? So the institutional trace to the unmotivated trace leads him to the originary trace, which, if it's really originary in the way he's claiming, can't possibly be just to do with language. That's where the linguistic turn, I was trying to think of ways of representing this. It's not just that he's turned it away from the Platonic or Lockean model where it all starts with the tree. Saussure turns it all round so it all starts at the other end of the story with the sign and perhaps with the signifier. I accept that extension. It's as if Derrida keeps turning and it kind of turns the language inside out or something. I couldn't find a way to represent it, where the very relationship that was still in play in those diagrams, even the Saussurean ones, between language over here and something else, call it the world over there, that kind of binary just doesn't seem to be happening anymore, right? And I think it's going to be a consequence of Derrida's thinking that too, it's like a kind of subject-object binary or something, is itself going to be radically put in question by pursuing this thought of the trace to ever more originary places. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And pardon my ignorance because coming into this book, it's not clear to me why Derrida concludes that there's nothing outside the text. Because this idea of the profound relationality, the interconnection between the things that ultimately give meaning to the sense of the autonomous term of the object. It seems to me that one could also suggest that human beings are actively constructing this process. That humans are socialized into seeing the world through a series of atoms. And humans agree to see difference in things. And in final analysis, one could perhaps point the finger at human beings external to the text.
Yeah.
As being so instrumental in
it's a tempting thing to think. Derrida would say that what we call human beings are constituted by this process. That it's not that they have some extra textual solidity on the basis of which they generate text. For him, that's still a very metaphysical way of thinking about it, right? He's going to say that we come to ourselves, insofar as we ever do come to ourselves, in that flickering, tracy kind of way, right? So insofar as we're present to ourselves as ourselves at all, that emerges from this more general trace structure. So he thinks that any point where you try to bail out of that process, so many people would say, well, God, at least God isn't textual. He's going to say, well, no, I'm going to claim that God is a byproduct of this textuality, as precisely a fantasy of putting an end to it. God is a fairly promising candidate. And he says in some of the readings I suggested that the very notion of the sign as being made of signifier and signified, the signified is always a bit on the side of God in that kind of thing, that the sign and a certain conception of God belong together historically. And that if we mess with the sign and decide we don't need the signified, we've also made a gesture against certain conceptions. He's thinking of classical rational conceptions like you find in Descartes and people of God, that too is going to be in big trouble. But similarly, he thinks it's very tempting, and many people have tried it, to say, all right, it's not, okay, we won't do God, but what about man? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's standing in position that he often calls the position of the transcendental signified, right? So the thought is that people might recognize that, sure, language has all this relational stuff going on. That's okay, that's sort of how it works. But that at a certain point, it must be possible to get out of that textuality into something more solid. Derrida is going to pretty relentlessly say, however you try to do that, you'll be pulled back in, or it will turn out to have been simply a byproduct of the text you were trying to do without. So the form of that reaction is fairly common. What Derrida is trying to suggest with the nothing outside the text is that there is no place to stand. Even though the history of Western metaphysics, as he calls it, is in some ways the history of proposals of places you could stand outside that. And he thinks they've worked themselves out, or they've deconstructed, let's say, in that middle voice kind of way, with obviously help from Nietzsche and Heidegger and all sorts of other people. And then this is a proposal of trying to think without an origin, without an end, with none of those absolute terms that would have to be thought of as being outside the text. What happens if we don't allow ourselves that kind of origin, that kind of end, that kind of transcendence, even that kind of referential world? So all the things that are invoked to put a stop to the textuality. So what happens if we don't do any of those and let the textuality do its thing, and suggest that all those other things in fact emerge from it as a more or less disavowed relationship to it? Well, except that not. I mean, he would say that this is not a prison house. It's not a prison house because there's no clear edges to this. It's not like the prison house of language argument where, oh, I'm so miserable because language doesn't give me the means to express my precious feelings. Maybe the French have a word for it, but I don't. You know, that kind of view. I don't think that's what he's saying. I mean, if we take seriously that turning inside out of the relation between language and the world, so literally everything is in the textual system, there's no outside to it, then it's not a prison. It's all outside as well. He says, when he follows up on that scandalous claim there's nothing outside the text, he says, I could just as well have said there's nothing inside the text. Or it's all outside the text. The text is all outside. It's a kind of exteriority. So we don't have precious subjective interiorities we can retreat to and hold on to in that nice way that we sometimes do, and then lament the fact that language is too coarse an instrument to allow us to express them. He thinks all that has to be rethought. Yeah.
That was a beautiful example. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
But I want to ask how the tension between the repaired cortex and another gesture differs from the structure of the mind as Freud and
Yeah.
represented.
Yeah. No, it's very close. Derrida learns a lot from Freud. He finds a lot in Freud that is still, a bit like with Saussure, mired in a traditional conceptuality that he thinks Freud hasn't fully thought through. But he definitely learns a lot from Freud. What he thinks, though, is that let's say that the unconscious, in the Freudian sense, allows for something like that distinction between that's what I said, that's what I consciously thought I was saying, but unconsciously, after a certain work of analysis or interpretation, it turns out that I really was saying, I want to kill my father and sleep with my mother, right? Even though that's not what I said. Right? So there's definitely a similarity. Derrida doesn't see any particular reason to ground that in the structure of a psyche. It's not necessarily just a human issue or a psychic issue, even though psychoanalysis is tapping into some of the same kinds of issues. So he's not, for example, saying, in the Rousseau reading, he's not saying Rousseau's unconscious is kind of responsible for that other strand of stuff that he's drawing out. That for him would be a very committal gesture. He doesn't kind of need it. It's one of those I don't need that hypothesis moments. I can do what I'm doing with Rousseau's text simply by looking and reading the text without, as it were, speculating about Rousseau's unconscious. He has, in the question of method section, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, one of the things that he's interestingly vehement about, I've written about this because it is interesting, he's interestingly vehement about saying, in spite of appearances, this is not a psychoanalytic reading. And of course, any analyst is going to say, I know denial when I hear it, right? It's like, Freud's example. I dreamt about a woman. It was not my mother. So, it was his mother. Derrida says this is not a psychoanalysis. And of course, people have responded in that way. And the proximity is great. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Derrida would say, if pushed, that psychoanalysis still buys into too many of the metaphysical presuppositions that he thinks he's got a handle on. So the notion of the psyche, even the notion of the unconscious, to some extent, if you're not careful, turns out to be something present elsewhere. It's just not immediately obvious. So there's a lot of engagement in Derrida with psychoanalysis, a lot of disagreements with Lacan, especially, who came up a couple of times in the talk. But, it's, how should I put it, especially given the way the world is at the moment, I think deconstructors and psychoanalysts need to be friends at the moment. Yeah. Yep.
It's easy enough. You can pull it first. I wanted to ask you a question that was kind of related to the access to political thinking not possible otherwise. And maybe ask you to explain or speak a tiny bit about dans la même possibilité, that turn of phrase. I haven't read this section recently, but I know that can be
Yeah. These.
But often when you get down a game or a topical something lots of people
Yeah, I mean, it's a desperately difficult couple of pages. I used to know the page numbers in the French edition by heart, and then they reprinted it with different pagination, which sort of ruined my life a little bit. And he makes a lot of very big claims, and some of them formulated in that presents itself in the dissimulation of it. So all that trace talk is in the same couple of pages from which this is taken. But I think what he's there struggling to contain is a bit that brilliant insight moment where he's going to say, I have, in a sense, in one thought, the basis here for how we might think about language, we might think about, let's say, ethics, relation to the other. So qualifying it as ethics is maybe a bit premature, and the movement of temporalization. And it's kind of all the same thing. Huh? It's complicated to say it's kind of all the same thing because that same thing is difference, right? So the sameness and difference thing gets awkward. But I think his thought was that maybe, like many people, he would have assumed that the analysis of temporalization, for example, as he discovered it in Husserl and Heidegger and behind them in Kant, I guess, that was a different kind of issue from the kind of issue you're going to encounter if you're talking about Saussure and language, and maybe different again from the kind of issue you're going to encounter in Lévinas if you talk about the priority of the other as a ground for ethics or something like that. And it's as if he said, no, it's all the same. That's the kind of clash. It's all the same. And figuring out what he means by trace in a way that is prior to the distinction of those domains, I think that's what he's excited about. I mean, I didn't have time to talk about the temporality argument, which is pretty neat. It's not, in some ways, it's not as hard, I think. But in some ways, of course, the relation to the other, that's the whole story anyway. That's what we were talking about. We're talking about, you know, the signs or the signifiers relating to the other. That's kind of what we were talking about in a very general way. So you can kind of see how, and if I'd been smarter about the way I presented it, we'd have had temporality in there too. There's a whole argument with Saussure's famous synchronic, diachronic, and other pairs of terms that Saussure uses that brings in this more complex temporality. So Derrida's pretty clear that this trace thing, which is not a thing, this trace business, if he can formulate it, will be the place from which you might start to, as it were, rederive or redescribe temporality, language, and let's just call it ethics. So, you know, he's in his mid-30s. He's had this big insight. He's very excited about it, and he generates these almost unreadable pages as a result. I think trying to, and then spends the next 40 years sort of slowly figuring it out. So one of the things about Derrida is there's no real break or discontinuity in his work. It's extraordinarily consistent, even if it focuses in on different ways and has slightly different idioms at different times, becomes a bit more literary, a bit more autobiographical. But the basic thought, here's the fantasy, right, that somebody writing about Derrida could have. And the trouble with it is that it's a completely metaphysical fantasy. Right? So it's a non-Derridian fantasy about how you might approach Derrida. And that would be to find the moment, because probably his blinding insight happened actually when he was younger. If you read some of his very early work, stuff he was writing on Husserl when he was in his early 20s, it's kind of already happening there. Not as explicitly as here, but it's kind of already happening. So the fantasy is you would find the originary moment at which he had the blinding insight that there are no originary moments. That's the kind of double bind that the Derridian is sometimes caught in. I don't know if I'm exactly answering the question. Yeah.
So I have a question that Derrida used the word ethnocentric. So he's responding to a tradition of Western thought that he calls metaphysics, that he sees as being logocentric, and I think I understand what you mean there. And then he also says ethnocentric. And I think that has something to do with the idea of writing being a representation of speech and phonetic writing.
That's part of it, yeah.
But to be honest, I've never quite understood. I've understood the speech versus writing thing, but the idea of phonetic languages being the best kind because they best represent speech. I mean, I guess when I say it out loud, I can kind of reconstruct the logic, but I don't exactly know.
Well, he's thinking
ethnocentric, exactly how that fits into it.
Well, he's thinking partly of what Hegel says, right? Hegel says that in itself the alphabetic writing system is the most intelligent, as opposed to, and Hegel's main counterexample is Chinese, which he has, I think, a very imperfect understanding of, as did many Westerners for centuries, I think, right? The idea was that Chinese was an ideogrammatic language, whereas, of course, there are phonetic elements in Chinese too. I don't really know much about Chinese, but I think I know that much. So it was a misrecognition and a tendency to say, look at these ridiculous Chinese people who need hundreds and thousands of characters because they don't realize that the intelligent writing system is a writing system that simply reflects the spoken word, which is, after all, the true place of language. It's bound up with all those prejudices about as you say, logocentrism. So the idea, as I speak, my meaning is here. It's rational, it's graspable, and so on. So all the things that go along with that metaphysics of presence, the privileging of speech, because in speech, as I speak, I'm present to my, supposedly, as if I'm present to my intentions, I know what I'm saying. It's if it doesn't communicate, you can ask me, I can disambiguate, all of those sort of things we imagine. Whereas if I write it down, it sticks around and it's available for misreading. So all the prejudices in favor of voice mean that the best writing system, if you're kind of against writing in general for those reasons, is going to be the one that modestly limits itself to merely reflecting the spoken form of the language. And that's the fantasy of the phonetic alphabetic. I mean, one thing Derrida points out, as you probably know, is that even so-called phonetic writing systems, there's all sorts of stuff that they don't do about speaking, right? He quotes Rousseau saying, I wish there was an irony symbol that you could use in writing to reflect a certain kind of ironic intonation in speech. All linguists know that written forms, even in so-called alphabetic or phonetic systems, there are gaps between the words. In most spoken talk, there are no gaps between the words. There are all sorts of fundamental ways in which those writing systems are not merely a representation of the flow of speech, but that's the fantasy. And then the idea is that, hey, look, it happens that it's the Western languages that do that, as opposed to the poor Mexicans with their pictograms and the Chinese with their ideograms. And so that's where the ethnocentric moment comes in. It gets a bit more complicated because you probably, I get a sense you've read more of this, the exchange with Lévi-Strauss, which is pretty vicious on Derrida's part, where Lévi-Strauss, with all good conscience, thinks he's absolutely not being ethnocentric. He thinks he's empathizing with the Amerindian tribe that he was working with. He thinks he's, in a sense, protecting them from the bad interruption of writing and all that goes with it because they're in their natural innocence and so on and so forth. And Derrida doesn't have that much difficulty showing this as a kind of reverse ethnocentrism. It's a kind of, I'm not being ethnocentric, I think the natives are wonderful. You can sense, right? It's not okay. It's not okay as a gesture. So even if it's not perhaps as bad as the straightforward, look at the stupid, primitive people who don't even have a decent writing system, maybe it's better to say, look at the wonderful native people who don't even need writing because they're living in harmony with nature and so on and so forth. You can see it's still got a condescending kind of ethnocentric edge. So that's partly, complicates but in a way reinforces, I think, the point about ethnocentrism. Having said that, there are some people who think that Derrida doesn't know enough about Chinese and that he himself makes some blunders in the way he talks about Chinese, and that after all he could have gone and done some more work on that, because he seems quite happy talking about the Western philosophers who make up the tradition that he's deconstructing. He seems, pretty thrilled with those guys because it gives him so much to talk about and fetch about. So that's a possible complication. Were you sorry? Sorry. I thought you were waving. Maybe we're done. Oh.
I don't know where to start exactly what you said. Derrida with the cases and so on, with the meaning and with the justice.
Gets away from truth. I can give you a super quick version of that, but it really has to be super quick because it's horribly difficult. There's a moment in Derrida's work that is often presented as an ethical turn, as though before that he hadn't done ethics and after that he's doing ethics. And part of what I'm suggesting is that this relation to the other remark here, much earlier than that so-called turn, is in fact already opening into that ethical domain, even if it's not as foregrounded, it's true in the earlier work. So in the late 80s, early 90s, Derrida was invited by a bunch of lawyers to a conference called Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice. And I think that context has something to do with what he then did. And what he did was to include in his lecture the claim that deconstruction is justice. You want to know about justice? This is justice. Right? And they're the more formal argument that says justice rather than truth, right? Is at that point in his work where he's more than in this earlier phase, where he's extremely interested in speech act theory. He's very suspicious of it as well, very critical of it, but fundamentally pretty interested in it. And he tries to push the notion of performative. Of course, it's now been taken up by all sorts of people, like performativity and so on. And there he says that in truth claims, so the kind of statement that Austin would have called a constative statement, as Austin himself kind of intimates, there's a sort of performative dimension to it, right? So if I say there's a bottle of water on the table, somewhere there's an implied, I hereby declare that there's a bottle of water on the table, or I hereby ask you to believe me that there's a bottle of water on the table. And those sort of dimensions of the truth claim, as far as Derrida can see, engage with a dimension that is not itself a truth dimension. So the issue when I say, I declare and I would really like you to believe me when I say that there's a bottle of water on the table, those dimensions can't be easily brought under the truth claim part of what it. So for him, he's going to say, in a fairly broad way still, that dimension brought in by the performatives is the dimension he's going to call justice. That's where justice becomes an issue, right? And an issue that, as far as he can see, takes a kind of priority over the truth claim talk. In some way, you can kind of see why that's an attractive thought. It's one way of saying, let's imagine that science, for example, is completely and quite properly bound to truth. It's going to speak the truth. Tons of issues that we can all see are not going to be covered by that, whatever the prestige of science and scientific discourse in the culture. I think everybody can see that there's a whole range of things beyond that kind of truth talk which engage ethico-political kinds of issues, and that scientists are often pretty hopeless with because they're busy being scientists. It's totally understandable. So I think it's too quick to put it that way. I think that's the kind of thing he then starts being more explicitly interested in. We would probably need to say some more about that. But that's the explicit claim in this lecture he gave called Force of Law, which is the lecture he gave at that conference in 88, 89, I think, called Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice. Maybe we're done. Thank you.